On the night of September 7th, 1940, the sky over London turned orange. German bombers had come in waves, more than 300 of them, dropping high explosives and incendiaries on the densely packed neighbourhoods of the East End. They would return the next night, and the night after that, and for 57 consecutive nights, the Blitz had begun. British civilians huddled in underground stations while their city burned above them. Firefighters battled blazes they could not contain. Rescue workers pulled bodies from rubble that had been homes just hours before. The Thames reflected flames that could be seen 40 miles away. By the time the bombing campaign ended 8 months later, more than 43,000 British civilians were dead. Across all of Britain, more than 2 million people had lost their homes. Adolf Hitler believed the bombing would break British morale. He believed that civilians who faced nightly terror would demand their government sue for peace. He believed that Britain, already battered by the evacuation at Dunkirk, could not endure the psychological punishment of night after night after night of bombing. In this belief, he was catastrophically wrong. 8,000 miles away, in a small aircraft factory in Hawthorne, California, an engineer named Jack Northrop was sketching something that did not yet exist. He had never built a night fighter. Neither had anyone else in America. The established experts said it could not be done. They said the technology was too new, the engineering too complex, the timeline too short. The radar systems required weighed hundreds of pounds and consumed enormous electrical power. The crews would need months of specialized training. The entire concept of fighting in darkness seemed to violate fundamental principles of aerial warfare. Northrop looked at his sketch and told his team they would build one anyway. The skeptics believed America could not master night combat. They looked at a nation without night fighters, without airborne radar, without any doctrine for fighting in darkness, and concluded that such capabilities were beyond American reach. They were about to be proved catastrophically wrong. The problem was simple and terrifying. British fighter pilots could not find German bombers in darkness. On the night the Luftwaffe devastated Coventry in November 1940, an attack that destroyed the medieval cathedral and killed more than 500 civilians, Royal Air Force Fighter Command flew approximately 125 sorties and shot down exactly 0 bombers, not one. Anti-aircraft guns fared little better, requiring roughly 30,000 shells in September 1940 to bring down a single aircraft. This ratio improved dramatically as gunners gained experience, dropping to roughly 4,000 shells per kill by January 1941. But in those early months, the German bomber loss rate during the Blitz was a mere 1 to 2%, a number so low that Luftwaffe commanders considered night raids essentially risk-free. The mathematics of night defense were brutal and unforgiving. A bomber flying at 200 miles per hour crosses roughly 3 miles of sky every minute. A defending fighter, even if somehow pointed in the right direction, has perhaps 30 seconds to spot a dark aircraft against a dark sky before it passes beyond visual range. Searchlights helped only in clear weather and reached just 12,000 feet, well below the altitude at which bombers typically operated. Sound locators were crude and slow, providing bearings that were often minutes out of date by the time a fighter could respond. The Royal Air Force tried mounting pilots with exceptional night vision in specially modified aircraft, the so-called cat's eye fighters, but human eyes simply could not find targets reliably in three-dimensional darkness. A pilot might fly within 500 feet of a bomber and never see it. British military intelligence understood that radar offered the only real solution. They had been developing ground-based radar since 1935, and the chain home stations had proven decisive during the Battle of Britain. But detecting an incoming raid and actually intercepting individual bombers were entirely different problems. Ground radar could tell you that enemies were coming. It could not tell a pilot which way to turn when he was 10,000 feet up with nothing but blackness outside his canopy. The answer was airborne intercept radar, a miniaturized system that could fly aboard a fighter and guide its pilot to targets invisible to the naked eye. The British began developing this technology in 1936. By the summer of 1940, they had achieved the first successful radar-guided interception when a Blenheim shot down a Dornier off the Sussex coast on July 22nd. But the Blenheim was too slow to catch most bombers, and the early radar sets were primitive, unreliable, and heavy. The Bristol Beaufighter became Britain's first effective radar night fighter, entering squadron service in September 1940. Flight Lieutenant John Cunningham, of No. 604 Squadron, scored the first radar-assisted Beaufighter kill on November 19, 1940. His famous nickname, Cat's Eyes Cunningham, came from propaganda claiming his exceptional night vision resulted from eating carrots. In reality, the nickname was a cover story to conceal the existence of airborne radar from the Germans. By May 1941, British night defences were finally making a real difference. On the night of May 10th, the last major Blitz raid, Royal Air Force night fighters and anti-aircraft guns together destroyed 14 German bombers. The combination of improved radar, better tactics, and more experienced crews had made the night sky over Britain far more dangerous. The de Havilland Mosquito night fighter followed, entering service in early 1942, and eventually accounting for approximately 600 German aircraft over Britain. The United States Army Air Corps, meanwhile, had nothing. American doctrine was committed to daylight precision bombing, developed at the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field, Alabama. There was no planning for night defense because American strategists were confident that the United States was safe from attack, protected by two impossibly wide oceans. This complacency shattered when Lieutenant General Delos Emmons, serving as U.S. air officer in London, witnessed the German air campaign against Britain in the summer of 1940. Though he arrived in August before the Blitz proper began in September, he saw enough of the Battle of Britain to understand what was coming. He returned to Washington with an urgent message. America needed a night fighter of its own. On October 21, 1940, an engineer named Vladimir Pavleka was at Wright Field, Ohio, on routine Northrop Corporation business. While there, Colonel Lawrence Craigie called him to a classified briefing. Craigie described the specifications for a night interceptor pursuit airplane equipped with a secret device that could locate enemy aircraft in darkness. He did not reveal that this device was radar. He simply told Pavleka to memorize the requirements without taking notes. Pavleka flew back to California and met with Jack Northrop the following morning. Northrop had already been exploring night fighter concepts after discussions with the British Purchasing Commission, which had approached him about designing a radar-equipped interceptor. The British requirements and Craigie's specifications aligned remarkably well. Within a week, Northrop had a preliminary design ready. On November 5, 1940, Northrop and Pavleka presented their concept at Wright Field. The contract timeline moved swiftly by wartime standards. Northrop submitted his formal specification 8A on December 5, 1940. A contract for two XP-61 prototypes was signed in January 1941, with a cost ceiling of $1,367,000. An order for 13 YP-61 service test aircraft followed on March 10th. After a mock-up inspection in April, the review board recommended moving the cannons from the wings to the belly, a change that eliminated convergence problems and would prove tactically brilliant. After Pearl Harbor, orders multiplied. 100 aircraft were ordered on December 24, 1941. By February 1942, the total had expanded to 410. Northrop Aircraft Corporation, headquartered in Hawthorne, California, was an unlikely choice for such a critical program. The company was barely a year old. But established manufacturers like Lockheed, Grumman, and Douglas were already committed beyond capacity. Northrop would have to make this work. The design that emerged was unlike any fighter that had come before, and unlike anything most aviation experts thought possible. The P-61 would be the largest fighter aircraft of the entire war, comparable in size to a B-25 Mitchell medium bomber. It needed to be large because it had to carry so much. The airborne radar system alone weighed more than 400 pounds and required substantial electrical power from generators driven by the engines. A three-man crew was required, consisting of pilot, radar operator, and gunner, each with specialized equipment and dedicated workspace. Heavy armament included both cannons and a powered turret, adding more weight and complexity. Sufficient fuel for extended patrol endurance, typically 4 to 5 hours aloft, added still more. General Hap Arnold, upon first seeing the aircraft, reportedly quipped, asking who was responsible for this assortment of built-in headwinds. The comment captured the skepticism many felt. A fighter was supposed to be small, light, and nimble, able to twist and turn in dogfights with enemy aircraft. The P-61 was none of these things. It was a twin-engine, twin-boom monster with a wingspan of 66 feet and a maximum takeoff weight exceeding 36,000 pounds. Pilots accustomed to nimble single-engine fighters looked at the Black Widow and wondered how anyone could fight in something so large. But the design choices were deliberate, each one justified by the unique requirements of night interception. The twin-boom configuration provided a stable gun platform and enhanced stability during intercept approaches when the pilot needed to hold precise airspeed and heading while his radar operator called out corrections. Turbulence from disturbed air, common at night when temperature inversions created invisible pockets of rough air, could throw off an aiming solution in the final critical seconds before firing. The P-61's mass and twin-boom design dampened these disturbances. The central nacelle gave the crew unobstructed visibility forward and to the sides, essential for the visual identification required before firing. A pilot had to see his target with his own eyes to confirm it was hostile. Shooting down friendly aircraft was not merely tragic but potentially catastrophic to the coordination between ground controllers and night fighters. The nacelle's generous glazing maximized the chance of visual acquisition in the final moments of an intercept. Tricycle landing gear simplified night operations considerably. Conventional tail-dragger landing gear required pilots to taxi with the nose pointed skyward, blind to what lay ahead. On dark airfields with minimal lighting, this was dangerous. The P-61's nosewheel kept the aircraft level during all ground operations, allowing pilots to see where they were going even on the blackest nights. The aircraft could absorb the weight of sophisticated radar equipment while still achieving speeds exceeding 360 miles per hour at altitude, fast enough to catch any bomber in enemy inventories. The armament was devastating. 4 20mm Hispano M2 autocannons were mounted in the belly, closely spaced on the center line in 2 stacked pairs. Each cannon carried 200 rounds. This arrangement eliminated convergence issues because all 4 guns hit the same point. 4 50-caliber Browning machine guns sat in a General Electric remotely controlled dorsal turret, the same type used on B-29 superfortresses. The turret could rotate a full 360 degrees, and each gun carried 560 rounds. External hardpoints could carry bombs, drop tanks, or later in the war, high-velocity aircraft rockets. The turret caused significant problems during development. When rotated off-center at speed, it created aerodynamic buffeting of the tail surfaces. This problem, combined with production priority for B-29 turrets, created severe supply shortages. Only the first 37 of 200 P-61A models were delivered with the turret installed. Many early aircraft flew without it. The turret was eventually reintroduced on the P-61B-15 subvariant after engineers partially corrected the buffeting issue. Many field units locked the turret to fire forward only, controlled by the pilot, or removed it entirely and installed extra fuel tanks in the empty space. The heart of the P-61 was not its guns but its radar. The SCR-720 represented one of the war's great collaborative achievements between American and British scientists. Its lineage began with the cavity magnetron, a revolutionary British invention that made practical microwave radar possible. Before the magnetron, radar sets operated at longer wavelengths that required enormous antennas. The cavity magnetron generated high power at wavelengths short enough to fit a practical antenna inside an aircraft. It was perhaps the most valuable piece of technology transferred during the entire war. The September 1940 Tizard mission brought this secret technology to America, delivered in a small black box that one scientist later called the most valuable cargo ever to cross the Atlantic. The magnetron catalyzed microwave research at the newly established MIT Radiation Laboratory in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Some of America's finest physicists gathered there, including future Nobel laureates, to solve problems that had seemed impossible just months before. The Rad Lab's engineers solved the problem of helical scanning, continuously rotating the antenna dish in azimuth while nodding in elevation. This created a scanning pattern that swept through the sky ahead of the aircraft, detecting targets in all directions. Their prototype first flew in a Douglas B-18 on March 10, 1941. Western Electric engineered this into production as the SCR-520, but at 600 pounds it was too heavy for practical fighter use. The definitive SCR-720 weighed 412 pounds and could detect aircraft at ranges of 3 to 5 miles, sufficient to guide a pilot from a ground controller's handoff all the way to visual range. The radar operator sat in the rear of the central nacelle, facing backward, watching two cathode ray tube displays in the darkness. A/B scope showed range versus azimuth, displaying targets as blips whose horizontal position indicated bearing and whose vertical position indicated distance. A C-scope showed bearing versus elevation, allowing the operator to guide the pilot up or down as well as left or right. The display rims were lined with fur to block ambient light and protect the operator's night-adapted vision. Red cockpit lighting preserved night vision throughout the aircraft. The pilot had a smaller 3-inch C-scope mounted below the gun sight for the final approach to the target, allowing him to make precise corrections in the last 1,000 feet before visual acquisition. The XP-61 prototype flew for the first time on May 26, 1942, with test pilot Vance Breeze at the controls. Breeze declared after landing that the aircraft flew beautifully and was an old man's airplane. YP-61 service test aircraft were delivered between August and September 1943. The first production, P-61A, rolled off the line in October 1943. Operational units began receiving aircraft in May 1944, nearly 4 years from conception to combat. Total production reached 706 P-61 fighters plus 36 F-15, a reporter photo reconnaissance variants. The breakdown included 200 P-61A models, 450 P-61B models, and 41 P-61C models. The final P-61C variant featured turbo-supercharged engines producing 2,800 horsepower at war, emergency power, achieving top speeds of 430 miles per hour, but none of the C models saw combat before the war ended. The first P-61 aerial victory came on the night of June 30, 1944, over Saipan in the Mariana Islands. The crew was Second Lieutenant Dale Haberman as pilot, and Flight Officer Raymond Mooney as radar operator, flying with the 6th Night Fighter Squadron. Their aircraft was a P-61A named Moonhappy, a name combining Mooney's surname with Haberman's nickname. Ground control detected an incoming intruder heading toward Haberman's patrol area. He positioned below the approaching aircraft, went to full power, and executed a 180-degree turn to get behind the target. Radar operator Mooney noted something unusual. The single radar blip suddenly became two. A Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber was flying with a Japanese fighter tucked in close formation. Haberman engaged the Betty, firing 327 rounds of 20mm ammunition and 525 rounds of 50 caliber while burning 550 gallons of fuel. The bomber exploded and fell. The fighter disappeared into the night. The only damage to the P-61 was some debris striking the left engine cowling. America's purpose-built night fighter had drawn first blood. The first P-61 victory in Europe came on July 16, 1944. Lieutenant Hermann Ernst was the pilot, and Lieutenant Edward Kopsel was the radar operator. They flew with the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron in an aircraft named Borrowed Time. The name carried dark meaning. Both men were sole survivors of previous aircraft accidents. They considered themselves to be flying on borrowed time. The night before, Ernst had attempted to intercept a V-1 flying bomb, but his P-61's plastic rear cone imploded during the high-speed dive. He returned to base without a kill. The next night, July 16th, he succeeded. His target was another V-1, Germany's terror weapon, the pilotless buzz bomb that was raining destruction on London. Ernst closed on the small, fast-flying bomb and destroyed it. This was the first P-61 kill in the European theatre. The first kill of a manned aircraft in Europe came in mid-August 1944. The 422nd Night Fighter Squadron had transferred to Maupertus, France, supporting Allied ground forces after the Normandy invasion. On 1 August night, P-61 crews encountered German aircraft attempting to interfere with Allied operations. Squadron Commander Lieutenant Colonel Orris Johnson, flying a P-61 already damaged by flak, shot down a Focke-Wulf FW-190. Another crew destroyed a Messerschmitt Bf-110, but the night also brought loss. A P-61 named Impatient Widow was shot down by a Heinkel HE-177 of Kampfgeschwader 40. The crews of the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron developed into formidable night hunters as autumn turned to winter. The squadron had arrived in England in February 1944, shipping across the Atlantic aboard the RMS Mauretania. They arrived without aircraft and did not receive P-61s until May and June, missing D-Day entirely. But once equipped and trained, they made the nights over Europe dangerous for the Luftwaffe. Lieutenant Paul Smith as pilot and Lieutenant Robert Tierney as radar operator became the first American night fighter aces of World War II. They achieved this distinction on December 26, 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge. That night, they shot down 2 Junkers Ju-188 bombers, bringing their total to 5 manned aircraft plus 1 V-1 flying bomb for 6 confirmed victories overall. The psychological pressure of night combat was immense. On one mission, a German aircraft led them into a deliberate trap, a flak killing field. Their P-61 lost its port engine and suffered 87 holes, but made it back to base. Hermann Ernst and Edward Kopsel also achieved ace status on the night of March 1st to 2nd, 1945. The mission became legendary as the triple play. Taking off from Strip A-78 in Belgium at 03:48 hours, Ernst contacted Nuthouse ground control. In rapid succession, he engaged 3 enemy aircraft. First, a Messerschmitt B, F-110, which he hit but could not confirm destroyed. Then a Junkers Ju-87 Stuka at 500 feet, which he destroyed with a clean burst. 3 minutes later, Kopsel acquired a third target at 2.5 miles, another Stuka. Ernst closed to 1,000 feet, visually identified the aircraft, and destroyed it with 2 3-second bursts. The 2 confirmed Stuka kills brought their total to 5 manned aircraft destroyed, making them aces. Ernst later recalled firing and seeing strikes, knowing in that moment that he and Kopsel had joined an elite group. Before the war, Ernst had been a trombone player in the Tennessee National Guard. Now he was among the deadliest night hunters in the European sky. The 422nd Night Fighter Squadron finished the war as the highest-scoring U.S. Army Air Force's night fighter squadron. They claimed 43 manned aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. They also destroyed at least 5 V-1 flying bombs. Their success came despite chronic maintenance problems that often left only 4 of 16 aircraft operational at any given time. The 425th Night Fighter Squadron, the other American P-61 unit in Europe, evolved primarily into a night intruder and ground attack force. Beginning in December 1944, they used 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets and 20mm cannons to attack German trains, trucks, and supply lines. The cannons proved highly effective in destroying German locomotives. By early 1945, they even carried napalm for both destruction and illumination. On April 11, 1945, P-61 intruders destroyed 14 Luftwaffe aircraft in a single night, mostly Junkers Ju, 52 transports evacuating Nazi officers. In the Pacific Theater, the P-61 transformed night air defense and brought an end to years of frustration and vulnerability. For years, Japanese night raiders had conducted harassment attacks with near impunity, arriving after midnight, circling over American bases, and dropping bombs seemingly at random. Allied troops called these lone aircraft Washing Machine Charlie for the distinctive sound of their deliberately unsynchronized engines, a droning rhythm that made the aircraft difficult to locate by ear. The name varied from island to island. Some units called them Louis the Louse, or Midnight Charlie, or simply Charlie. Whatever the name, the effect was the same. The raiders disrupted sleep, destroyed aircraft on the ground, and caused casualties, all while remaining essentially untouchable. Night after night, exhausted American servicemen dove into foxholes or crouched in slit trenches, while bombs fell around them. The psychological toll was immense. Men who had to fight or work during daylight could not get adequate rest. Morale suffered, accidents increased. The Japanese understood exactly what they were doing. A handful of cheap, expendable aircraft could tie down thousands of enemy personnel and reduce their effectiveness without risking significant Japanese resources. The P-70 Havoc, a stopgap night fighter converted from the A-20 attack aircraft, had proven woefully inadequate. It was slow, poorly equipped with early model radar, and could barely catch the aircraft it was supposed to intercept. In the entire Pacific War, the P-70 managed only 2 confirmed kills. The night belonged to the enemy. The P-61 changed everything. 8 night fighter squadrons eventually operated P-61s across the Pacific, from the Mariana Islands to the Philippines to Okinawa to the very doorstep of Japan itself. On Saipan, the 6th Night Fighter Squadron discovered an effective tactic that exploited Japanese formation flying. If they could shoot down the lead bomber in a formation of roughly 12 Bettys flying 20 miles apart, the rest would often jettison their bombs and flee back to their bases. The Japanese apparently relied on visual signals from the lead aircraft for navigation and attack coordination. Once that aircraft went down in flames, the followers lost their way. In the Philippines, General George Kenney ordered P-61s to heckle Japanese convoys all night and keep them from unloading at Ormoc Bay. The tactic worked brilliantly. P-61 crews flew continuous patrols, forcing Japanese ships to remain at battle stations throughout the night, their crews unable to offload supplies or reinforcements. When daylight attack aircraft arrived with the morning sun, Japanese ships were still loaded with troops and equipment, making them even more valuable targets. The night fighters had multiplied the effectiveness of the entire air campaign. Major Carroll Smith as pilot and Lieutenant Philip Porter as radar operator of the 418th Night Fighter Squadron became the highest-scoring American night fighter crew of the war. On the night of December 29th to 30th, 1944, over Mindoro in the Philippines, they intercepted and destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft in a single night. This feat was unparalleled. Smith flew a P-61B named Times a Wastin. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron finished as the top-scoring unit in the Pacific with 18 total kills. One of the war's most dramatic P-61 missions occurred on January 30th, 1945, a mission that had nothing to do with shooting down enemy aircraft. American Rangers, Alamo Scouts, and Filipino guerrillas were planning a daring raid to rescue more than 500 Allied prisoners from the Japanese camp at Cabanatuan in the Philippines. The prisoners included survivors of the Bataan Death March, men who had endured nearly 3 years of brutal captivity. As American forces advanced across Luzon, intelligence indicated the Japanese might massacre the prisoners rather than allow their liberation. Time was critical. The rescue plan required surprise. The camp was surrounded by Japanese positions, and any warning would doom both the prisoners and the rescuers. The problem was that Rangers needed time to crawl into position through open rice paddies surrounding the camp. Japanese guards in the watchtowers would certainly spot them in daylight, and probably hear them at night unless something distracted their attention. A single P-61 from the 547th Night Fighter Squadron provided that distraction. The aircraft was named Hard to Get, piloted by Captain Kenneth Schreiber with First Lieutenant Bonnie Rux as radar operator. At approximately 1840 hours, as dusk settled over the Philippine countryside, the P-61 arrived over the prison camp and began performing aerobatics at extremely low altitude. Schreiber deliberately cut power to create backfires and bangs from his exhaust. He faked engine trouble, sputtering and coughing, then roaring back to full power. He buzzed the camp at treetop level, drawing every eye skyward. For approximately 20 minutes, the P-61 held the attention of the entire Japanese garrison. Guards pointed and shouted. Officers emerged from their quarters to watch. No one was looking at the ground, where 121 Rangers and 14 Alamo Scouts were belly-crawling through the tall grass toward the perimeter fence. Filipino guerrillas moved into blocking positions on roads leading to the camp. When the ground assault began at 1945 hours, the P-61 shifted to a combat role. Schreiber strafed a Japanese convoy heading toward the camp from the nearby town of Cebu, destroying trucks and killing enemy soldiers who might have reinforced the garrison. The raid succeeded brilliantly. More than 500 Allied prisoners were rescued, along with approximately 33 civilians. Only 2 Rangers were killed, and no prisoners died during the extraction. General Douglas MacArthur later declared that no incident of the Philippine campaign had given him greater satisfaction. The P-61, designed to hunt enemy bombers in darkness, had helped liberate men who had given up hope of ever seeing home again. The controversy that followed the P-61 throughout its career concerned whether it was truly superior to the British de Havilland Mosquito. In May 1944, Generals Hoyt Vandenberg and Karl Spaatz, concerned the P-61 was too slow, requested Mosquitoes for American squadrons. Pilots of the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron reportedly threatened to turn in their wings if forced to give up their Black Widows. On July 5, 1944, General Spaatz ordered a competitive fly-off at Herne, England, between a 422nd Night Fighter Squadron P-61 and a Royal Air Force Mosquito NF Mark 17. The official result stated that the P-61 proved faster at all altitudes, outturned the Mosquito at every altitude, and demonstrated superior climb rate. Colonel Winston Kratz lost a $500 bet on the Mosquito. However, aviation historian Dana Bell later documented evidence that the test was likely rigged. The P-61 was specially tuned by Pratt & Whitney factory representatives and flown without its turret or third crewman by an aggressive and angry crew. The Mosquito was a line aircraft with no special preparation. The British pilot, Dick Leggett, was reportedly unaware he was even in a competition. Kratz himself later admitted that he was absolutely sure the British were lying like troopers and honestly believed the P-61 was not as fast as the Mosquito. But he added that come what may, the 61 was a good night fighter. The honest assessment is that the Mosquito was faster, especially at altitude, had longer range, and vastly higher production numbers. The Mosquito averaged 192 aircraft per month compared to the P-61's 30. The P-61's advantages were its purpose-built night fighter design, more powerful radar, superior turret firepower when equipped, and critically, its all-metal construction that survived tropical humidity. The Mosquito's wood and glue airframe delaminated in Pacific conditions. The fly-off resolved a bureaucratic impasse. The Royal Air Force could not spare Mosquitoes anyway, and the P-61 was cleared for European combat. The controversy would make excellent debate material for aviation enthusiasts, but operationally, both aircraft served effectively in their respective roles. The P-61's combat story ends with one of aviation's most extraordinary episodes. On the night of August 14th to 15th, 1945, the very night Japan announced its surrender, a P-61B named Lady in the Dark of the 548th Night Fighter Squadron was airborne over Ishima. The crew that night was Lieutenant Robert Clyde as pilot and Lieutenant Bruce LaFord as radar operator. They detected a Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighter. They pursued at wave-top level. The Japanese pilot, attempting evasive maneuvers at extreme low altitude, struck the water and exploded. Not a single shot was fired. The following night, August 15th to 16th, a different crew flying the same aircraft encountered a Nakajima Ki-44 Tojo. Captain Lee Kendall was the pilot, with Lieutenant John Shearer as radar operator. Again, wild maneuvering at low altitude during pursuit ended with the Japanese aircraft crashing into the sea. Again, no shots were fired. These are considered among the last aerial victories by a fighter aircraft in World War II. The delay in recognizing these achievements captured something about the nature of night fighter combat. These crews fought in darkness, often alone, their victories witnessed only by their radar operators. They lacked the glamour of daytime aces. Their kills came one at a time, through patient stalking rather than dramatic dogfights. Night fighting imposed unique psychological burdens. P-61 crews flew without wingmen because the risks of collision and friendly fire in darkness were too great. Paul Hendrickson, whose father flew P-61s from Iwo Jima with the 549th Night Fighter Squadron, wrote that he believed his father was scared out of his skull for most of his time there. Hendrickson also believed there must have been moments of godlike exhilaration mixed with the terrible fear. The story of Lieutenant Cletus Tommy Ormsby of the 425th Night Fighter Squadron illustrates the cruelty of night warfare. On the night of March 24, 1945, Ormsby attacked two Junkers, Ju-87 Stukas, destroying both according to his radar operator and corroborating witnesses. Moments later, he was killed by friendly fire. His radar operator survived with serious injuries, saved by German surgeons. Ormsby was never credited with his final two kills, and his colleagues maintained for decades that he deserved ace status. Among the more remarkable P-61 veterans was James Dickey, who served as a radar operator with the 418th Night Fighter Squadron in the Pacific, flying 38 combat missions. Dickey later became the 18th United States Poet Laureate, won the National Book Award, and wrote the novel Deliverance. His wartime experience profoundly influenced his poetry, particularly the poem The Firebombing. The P-61 Black Widow's combat record included 127 confirmed manned enemy aircraft destroyed and at least 9 V-1 flying bombs, though some sources count as many as 18 V-1s. These numbers are modest compared to the Mosquito's approximately 600 night kills over Britain alone. But raw statistics obscure what the P-61 truly accomplished, and why its story matters beyond the numbers. The aircraft ended the Japanese night harassment that had tormented Allied troops across the Pacific for years. From Saipan to Iwo Jima to Okinawa, American servicemen finally slept through the night because P-61 crews patrolled overhead. The psychological relief was immense. Men who could rest properly fought better. Accidents decreased. Morale improved. The value of this cannot be measured in kill counts. The P-61 provided the Army Air Forces with institutional knowledge of night fighting, radar operations, and ground-controlled intercept procedures that would directly inform Cold War air defense doctrine. The officers who commanded P-61 squadrons went on to leadership positions in the newly independent Air Force. The lessons they learned hunting invisible enemies over Europe and the Pacific shaped how America thought about defending its skies in the nuclear age. The continent-spanning radar networks and interceptor forces that protected North America during the Cold War trace their conceptual lineage directly to what these crews learned. Perhaps most importantly, the P-61 proved that purpose designing an aircraft around radar, rather than retrofitting existing airframes with radar as an afterthought, produced a fundamentally more capable weapons system. The British had taken Blenheims and Beaufighters and Mosquitoes and added radar to aircraft designed for other purposes. America had built an aircraft from the ground up to carry radar, to house a dedicated radar operator, to provide the stability and performance characteristics that radar interception required. Every modern interceptor and airborne early warning aircraft traces conceptual lineage to this approach. The idea that aircraft should be designed around their sensors, rather than having sensors bolted on afterward, seems obvious today. In 1940, it was revolutionary. The broader strategic question, whether the P-61 arrived too late, has a clear answer. Yes, it did, though through no fault of the aircraft or its crews. Combat operations began only after D-Day, with roughly 1 year of fighting remaining in both theatres. By mid-1944, Allied air superiority meant enemy night aircraft were increasingly rare over Europe. German Ju-88. Night fighters accumulated more night victories than all Allied night fighters combined, because they had years of darkness to hunt in before the Allies developed effective countermeasures. The P-61's kills were achieved one at a time, through lengthy solo pursuits in darkness, in a war where enemy night activity was already declining. The airplane was a good night fighter that arrived in a war already being won. This was not a failure of engineering or production. It was simply the reality of developing entirely new capabilities during wartime. 4 years from concept to combat is remarkably fast for an aircraft as complex as the P-61, built around technology that barely existed when the program began. The B-29, America's other revolutionary wartime aircraft program, took roughly the same time to develop. Some capabilities cannot be rushed, no matter how urgent the need. Production ended shortly after VJ Day. Of the 706 P-61s built, most were scrapped within years of the war's end. The aircraft had been designed for a specific mission in a specific conflict. That mission was complete. There was no peacetime role for a massive, specialized night interceptor burning hundreds of gallons of aviation fuel per hour. The jet age was dawning, and piston-engined night fighters were already obsolete. The future belonged to radar-equipped jets like the F-89 Scorpion and F-94 Starfire. 4 P-61s survive today, scattered across 3 continents, each with its own story of preservation against the odds. One sits in the Smithsonian's Stephen F. Udvar Hazy Center near Washington, D.C., displayed among the greatest aircraft in aviation history. This is a P-61C, serial number 438330, painted in its original olive-drab finish. It never saw combat, arriving too late, but it represents the final evolution of the type. Another survivor rests at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. This P-61C is painted as Moonlight Serenade, honoring the crews who flew from the Pacific Islands. It stands preserved as a monument to the men who hunted in darkness. A third P-61 sits in Beijing's Aviation Museum at Beihang University, a P-61B that flew with the 427th Night Fighter Squadron in the China-Burma-India theater. After the war, this aircraft was acquired by Chinese forces. It remains one of the few American World War II aircraft preserved in China. The fourth survivor has the most remarkable story of all. This P-61B, serial number 4239445, crashed on Mount Cyclops in Papua on January 10, 1945. The crew survived, but the aircraft was abandoned in the jungle, too remote and too damaged to recover. For decades it lay there, slowly being consumed by tropical vegetation. In 1989, the Mid-Atlantic Air Museum in Reading, Pennsylvania, organized an expedition to recover the aircraft. Helicopters lifted the major components from the mountainside in pieces. Since then, the restoration has continued for more than 3 decades, a labor of love consuming hundreds of thousands of hours and hundreds of thousands of dollars. The aircraft was fully painted and unveiled in June 2024. When the restoration is finally complete, it will be the world's only flying Black Widow. The men who flew these aircraft scattered back to ordinary lives after the war, carrying memories they rarely shared. The pilots became businessmen and engineers. The radar operators became teachers and accountants. The ground crews who kept the aircraft flying through tropical heat and European cold returned to farms and factories across America. They had achieved something remarkable, hunting invisible enemies through darkness using technology that had barely existed 5 years before. They had flown alone into hostile skies where a single mistake meant death without witnesses. Some struggled with what they had experienced. Night combat left psychological scars that daytime pilots sometimes escaped. The isolation was profound. There were no wingmen to share the danger, no formation mates to confirm a kill or witness a close call. A night fighter crew returned from a mission and could only tell others what had happened. There was no gun camera footage to review, no debriefing with squadron mates who had seen the same events. The darkness that protected them also isolated them. Others found the experience transformative in ways they could not fully explain. The poet James Dickey spent the rest of his life processing what he had seen and felt during those 38 missions over the Pacific. His poetry returned again and again to themes of flight and darkness, of the strange beauty and horror of aerial warfare. The firebombing he witnessed below him as he hunted for enemy aircraft burned itself into his imagination and never fully left. The skeptics who said America could not master night combat were wrong. They looked at a nation without night fighters and concluded it could never build one. They measured American capability by what existed rather than what could be created. They mistook present limitations for permanent ones. This error echoes across history. Nations still underestimate what others can achieve when necessity drives innovation. Leaders still confuse current capability with future potential. The German High Command believed the Americans were soft. They believed American industry could not deliver on impossible promises. They believed that material abundance could not compensate for German martial tradition. Every one of these beliefs was wrong. American engineers designed an aircraft that had never existed before. American workers built it in a factory that had barely existed before. American crews learned to operate technology that had barely existed before, and in the darkness over Europe and the Pacific, they hunted and killed enemies who never saw them coming. The P-61 Black Widow was not the most numerous fighter of the war. It was not the fastest or the most maneuverable. It claimed fewer kills than many single aircraft types. But it represented something important, the willingness to solve impossible problems through engineering and determination. Jack Northrop could not have known in 1940 that his sketch would become a weapon of war. Vladimir Pavleka could not have known when he memorized those specifications at Wright Field that he was helping birth a new kind of combat aircraft. The young men who would fly P-61s through enemy-filled darkness could not have known what awaited them. They did these things anyway. They designed an aircraft that experts said was impossible. They built it faster than anyone thought possible. They flew it into darkness against enemies they could not see. And when the war was over, they went home. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.